but not enough to help.
Well, we'll have another try at it later. Please go on, Mrs. Thurlow.
Well, that's almost all, Mr. Carter. Jim went out about 10 in the morning. I stayed here in my room reading. About half an hour later, I thought I heard a shot. All of a sudden, I was terribly frightened.
Frightened? Of what?
I don't know. It was just a feeling. Then I heard the far-off echo of somebody hammering. It was... Oh, it sounded like somebody hammering down the lid of a coffin. And I'm positive it meant that Jim was dead.
It's probably someone chopping down a tree, she heard, Nick. Anyway, she went back to her reading and forgot about it. Then around 1, Manstead phoned from the village, that's a little town about 10 miles from the hills, for Johnny to come for him in the station wagon.
Manstead phoned? But didn't he fly in by plane yesterday?
Seems not. The plane was in New York getting a new propeller, so he took the night train.
Is that so?
Anyway, Johnny went to meet him. He got here about 2:30. The rest of the story is just the way he told it to us. Nick Thurlow must have killed himself. There just isn't any other answer.
I wonder, Patsy. I wonder. Hello? Yes, speaking. Did you get the dope I wanted? He was? And the plane? Then check every airfield within 50 miles of the city. Yes, I know it's a big order, but somebody's playing this game for big stakes. No, that's all. Call me back when you've learned something.
Hello, Carter. I didn't know anybody was here in the library.
I took the liberty of phoning New York. I was trying to check on that mysterious plane that we saw crash yesterday afternoon.
I see. Did you learn anything?
Nothing yet.
You know, I have a theory about that plane, Carter.
I'd be interested to hear it, Mr. Manstead.
Well, we're only 100 miles from the border, and in the past, planes engaged in smuggling aliens into this country have landed in this region. Now, I'm willing to wager this chap, who was so anxious to avoid being seen, was engaged in doing something like that.
Certainly sounds plausible.
Nick! Oh, Nick!
Oh, yes, Cubby.
Oh, there you are. Oh, top of the morning to you, Mr. Manstead.
Good morning.
Say, I was looking for the two of you. Forest Ranger Thompson and 2 of his men are down at the landing waiting in your launch, Mr. Manstead. They want to get started down the lake to bring in the body of that flyer who was so unlucky when he bailed out of his plane yesterday.
Of course. You're coming with us, aren't you, Carter?
Yes, indeed. I'm just as interested as you are to see if your theory turns out to be right.
Oh, what about Patsy? Shall I go find her?
Oh, no, Scubby. She's staying here in the lodge with Mrs. Thurlow. They're going to spend the morning going over Thurlow's notes, trying to decipher them.
Well, let's get going. I want to get back in time to phone a story to my paper.
I'm afraid it's no use, Miss.
Please, just call me Patsy.
It's just impossible to read these notes of Jim's, Patsy. They're not only in his own shorthand, but most of them are in code, too.
Here's something that seems as if it might mean something. See, it says, I can HB it.
HB. Hardly believe. I can hardly believe it.
Yeah.
Of course, that's what it means.
And here's some more. It's clearer. Shall I tell Manstead what I know?
The next line. Better not.
Instead, must get back to New York. Well, that's clear enough.
But the next line. My life, MB, indeed. That doesn't mean anything to me.
My life, MB, indeed. My life may be in danger.
Oh.
And then there's just one last sentence that he never finished. To think that the one man in the world. And that's all there is.
Oh, if it only finished.
To think that the one man in the world. Oh, who do you suppose he could have meant?
I can't even make a guess.
The one man. Mrs. Thurlow.
What, Patsy?
Mrs. Thurlow, we're going to go and take a look at that cabin now while all the others are away. I have a theory, and we're going to find some evidence to prove it. It has to be there. It just has to be.
Nick, my friend. Hey, what's troubling you? You've been sitting out here on this rock for an hour ever since we got back, looking mean enough to bite your grandmother.
Scubby, that poor devil of an aviator whose body we brought in was murdered. And Thurlow was murdered. And I can't prove it.
But, Nick, couldn't you be wrong? The aviator certainly looked like a natural accident. And Thurlow, if I ever saw a case that looked more like suicide, well, I don't know where it was.
Well, that's just it. The aviator I can explain. Someone slipped through the woods, reached him before we did, climbed the tree he was caught in, and strangled him with the shroud lines in his parachute while pretending to help free him.
But Thurlow, his own footprints leading into the cabin. The window boarded over and the door bolted on the inside. If somebody killed him, well, how did they get out?
I don't know, Scubby. It isn't possible. And it was done. I'm going to break the... Hey, Scubby, what's that in your hand?
Oh, just a shiny new nail I picked up somewhere. Somebody must have been fixing something.
A nail. And Mrs. Thurlow said she heard the echo of hammer blows the morning her husband died.
Yeah, said they sounded like somebody hammering down the lid of a coffin. Dames sure have imaginations.
But that's just what she did hear.
Huh?
She heard the echoes of somebody nailing down the lid of a coffin.
But there must be a clue. There must be.
But we've been all over the cabin inside and out a dozen times now, Patsy. If there was anything here, we'd have found it.
Mrs. Thurlow, somehow your husband was murdered here, and his body left inside this cabin so it would look like suicide. And I'm going to find out how the murderer got out, leaving the door and window bolted, or die.
I'm afraid you're much more likely to die, Patsy.
Oh, Mr. Manstead.
Yes, Mr. Manstead. After we returned to the lodge and I learned the two of you had disappeared in this direction, I thought I'd better find out what you were up to.
You killed my husband.
Of course he did. Who else could your husband have meant by the one man in the world he'd never have believed guilty?
But he was Jim's friend.
That's what he wanted you to think. He pretended to be a friend so he could always keep checking what your husband learned. And he invited you both here so he could commit murder if he decided it was necessary.
A very interesting theory. But I'm afraid I can't give you a chance to tell it to anyone else. Johnny.
Right here, Mr. Manstead.
Come inside and close the door.
What are you going to do to us?
He thinks he's going to kill us. He hasn't got that gun in his hand for fun.
Johnny, the old mine shaft is close by. Now, if these two ladies out walking had the misfortune to stumble into it, it would be very tragic, wouldn't it?
Lots of people fall down old mine shafts.
So they do. And I'm afraid another such accident is about to happen.
You can't get away with it, Mr. Manstead. Nick Carter won't let you.
Oh, well, perhaps even clever Mr. Carter may have to have an accident. Help me silence him, Johnny. Quickly.
No, Nick!
Quiet!
No!
Quiet, I say! All right, now, Johnny, knock them both on the head to keep them quiet.
All right, Manstead. Let go of her.
You, Carter.
Nick, look out, his gun!
Drop it, Manstead, or
Johnny, kill him! Kill him!
Johnny, put down that axe or I'll shoot.
Yes, sir.
He's dead.
I'm afraid so. Patsy, either of you hurt?
No, Nick, you came just in time. But how?
How did I know Manstead was a murderer? I knew that from the time we found this cabin. But it took an echo to prove it. The echo, Mrs. Thurlow, that you said sounded like someone hammering.
But I don't understand.
Scubby's bringing Ranger Thompson. Soon as they get here, I think I'll be able to clear up a lot of mysteries. So Manstead was behind the plot that Thurlow uncovered. He invited Thurlow here in order to find out what he knew. He discovered Thurlow had evidence which would tell him the truth, and therefore decided to eliminate Thurlow.
But, Mr. Carter, Manstead didn't get here until after Thurlow was dead. He came by train. And...
Oh, Ranger Thompson's right, Nick.
He appeared to come by train. Actually, he flew in the night before in a plane whose pilot was used to taking big fees for keeping his mouth shut. That was the plane that we saw crash. Something delayed it from leaving in time to avoid us, and in the pilot's effort to keep away from us, well, we all know what happened.
But, Nick, why was the pilot murdered?
That was Johnny's work. As soon as Thurlow saw the crash, he sent Johnny by a secret trail through the woods to make sure the pilot didn't live to talk. Otherwise, his murder scheme would have collapsed. Isn't that right, Johnny?
Yes, sir.
So Manstead flew here the night before he murdered Thurlow. In the morning, when Thurlow left the house, he and Johnny waylaid him. Is that it, Nick?
That's it, Patsy. They brought him to the cabin here. Manstead put on his victim's shoes and made a trail of footprints.
I see.
Then they killed Thurlow, put his shoes back on him, and left him in the locked cabin. A clear case of suicide. But Manstead made a mistake there. His footprints were too far apart. They were the steps of a tall man. When Scubby said Thurlow was a short man, I began to suspect.
Well, it certainly does sound plausible, Mr. Carter. But you've still got to convince me Manstead could get out of that cabin and leave the door barred from the inside.
Make it good, Nick.
Johnny knows the answer. You all remember that Mrs. Thurlow said she heard the echo of hammer blows.
You mean she really did hear someone hammering?
Exactly. This is a small cabin with a roof lightly nailed in place. Now look up there. What's that flashing in the sun?
Looks like nail heads.
Somebody's hammered new nails into that roof all along this side.
Nick, is that the clue I was looking for?
That's the clue you were looking for. Scubby and I saw it yesterday, but we weren't smart enough to know what it meant. Here, I'll take Johnny's axe and push the blade in under the eaves and pry upward like that.
What the whole roof's lifting up.
Well, blow me down.
Manstead and Johnny pried up the flimsy roof before they killed Thurlow. Then, leaving the door barred, they climbed out. And Johnny nailed the roof back into place.
Right. So they were hammering the lid on the coffin, so to speak. Thurlow's coffin. And due to the curious echoing qualities of the rocks, the sound carried to the lodge, and Mrs. Thurlow heard it. I didn't think it meant anything until I noticed the nail Scubby picked up someplace. The nail Johnny must have dropped. And then I remembered the hammering sound Mr. Thurlow spoke of. And suddenly the whole thing was clear.
Well, it sure wouldn't have been clear to me if you hadn't explained it, Mr. Carter. I certainly wouldn't ever have worked it out with just an echo for a clue.
Oh, but that was an unusual echo. Remember how cleverly it answered?
And when it comes to answers, Scubby, Nick Carter is the man who gets them.
This was another strange experience of Nick Carter called The Echo of Death, or Nick Carter and the Phantom Clue. The curious adventures of Nick Carter, Master Detective, are brought to you every Monday night at 9:30 Eastern Wartime. We'll let Nick himself tell you about next week's story. What'll it be about, Nick?
I call it Death Across the Tracks. It began with the murder of a detective.
A railroad detective who lived in the station alongside the tracks. He was working on a case, but he had it only partly solved when he was murdered.
And I picked it up from there.
I'll say you did, Nick. You almost picked up a few bullets into the bargain the way the victim did. When you called it Death Across the Tracks, you were right in more ways than one.
This sounds more and more intriguing. And how'd it wind up, Nick?
Well, we'll tell you that next week. But I can say this much. I had a stroke of luck.
Nick always calls it luck when he uses foresight. Good night, folks.
Yes, good night, folks.
And good night, Patsy and Nick. In tonight's strange adventure, Nick Carter was impersonated by Lon Clark. Patsy was impersonated by Helen Choate. Original music was played by Lou White. The entire production was under the direction of Jock McGregor. Next week at 9:30 Eastern Wartime, listen to another curious adventure of Nick Carter entitled
Death Across the Tracks, or Nick Carter and the Mystery of the Midnight Train.
This story is a copyrighted feature of Street and Smith Publications, Incorporated. And here's a special note. Beginning next week, Nick Carter will be heard over most of these same stations on Mondays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Wartime. The Cisco Kid will be presented on Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Wartime. This is Mutual.